Sherlock Holmes as a character is in the public domain. He belongs to all of us. If you want to write a story where he fights a Dracula or hunts the Loch Ness Monster or has to survive an alien invasion, you can absolutely publish that. There's nothing stopping you. As long as you portray him as a cold, emotionless bastard. Due to some of the last few original Sherlock stories still being under copyright, aspects of the character introduced in those stories are still under lock and key, such as him having friends, or respecting women, or having any sort of basic empathy. Because those are kind of, endearing traits that most people want in their protagonists. You actually have to go through the estate of Arthur Conan Doyle if you want to use him. But you know what? Not everybody wants to do that, and not everybody's going to bother doing that. And you don't need to do that just to get your story about a cryogenically frozen Sherlock Holmes reanimated in the 22nd century off the ground, because for the last century and change, writers have been using one clever trick to get around that pesky copyright law. Moving the S. Herlock Sholmes. That's right, Herlock Sholmes. As the story goes, Maurice Leblanc wrote a book about his famed French gentleman thief Arsene Lupin going toe-to-toe with Sherlock Holmes, and Arthur Conan Doyle did not approve. So he changed the name to Herlock Sholmes, and there was nothing he could do about it. It was a brilliantly simple solution to a complex problem, and it persists to this day. Leblanc is often credited with being the origin of the name Herlock Sholmes, but believe it or not, that's not actually the case. There were actually multiple Herlock stories published anonymously in a handful of newspapers several years before Herlock fought Arsene. The earliest use of the name Herlock Sholmes, as far as I can tell, is a story published in 1895 in the Los Angeles Herald titled simply Mr. Herlock Sholmes. It's a brief tale about the great detective himself and a woman whose husband has gone missing. He accurately guesses a number of things about her, him, and their relationship, and he reveals to his assistant Walter Dodson that he only knows this because he saw her husband at the police station a few days prior. 1897 gives us another newspaper story, The Perspicacity of Herlock Sholmes, where Sholmes essentially calls out a Civil War veteran for embellishing tales. Searching newspaper archives led me to a few other results, primarily just extremely short gags to fill space. Like this one joke where Sholmes humorously deduces that since a woman's gloves were stolen, she was robbed left and right. The name Herlock Sholmes seems to have been pretty common among these types of jokes in this era. I even saw Walter Dodson show up a time or two, but as we will soon find, Herlock Sholmes folds up an eclectic cast of supporting characters and never keeps one assistant too long. Weirdly enough, their names often sound similar. The newspaper archives also led me to a few other longer stories, but most of these are still fairly short and were predated by the Lupin stories by several years, so I don't feel like they're as notable as the first few. Interestingly though, there were at least two different Sholmes stories published by one A. Donan Coyle, one in Chicago and one in Missouri. I don't know if these are the pseudonym of the same person, or just another instance of two people coming to the same conclusion independently. Or maybe it's just some guy's unfortunately real name. We may never know the truth. Among the most famous appearances of Herlock Sholmes is the trilogy of Arsene Lupin stories that most people know him from. Now, let's not beat around the bush here. 1906's Sherlock Holmes Arrives Too Late is Maurice Leblanc writing fan fiction in which his OC bests Sherlock Holmes. I'm not here to pretend it's anything else. It was an unauthorized crossover, and the name legally had to be changed in order for it to be published. Interestingly, there are actually versions of the story where the name Herlock Shears was used instead, and I just want to say I absolutely love that name. Herlock Shears. Herlock Sholmes returns in two more stories published from 1906 to 1907 that were collected into a book titled Arsene Lupin vs. Herlock Sholmes, and essentially, Lupin outfoxes Sholmes and his pal Wilson 3 times in a row. These stories were also adapted into a series of German film serials in 1910 that are now considered lost media. The 19-teens in general saw a veritable boom of Herlock content. The 1913 French silent short film The Amateur Sleuth features a man receiving a threatening letter demanding $4.98 and enlists the help of Herlock Sholmes. $4.98 seems like a comically small amount to us today, but back in 1913 that would have been over $130, which is still pretty small for a ransom, but not the pocket change it sounds like. The Italians also got in on the silent Sholmes shorts industry with Rodolphe e Mulo di Herlock Sholmes, which, I'm gonna be honest here, I only know from this IMDb page, which contains only the name of one actor. I could not find it to watch, and I couldn't find any further details. I don't know what happens in this one. One of the most prolific additions to the Herlock canon came in the form of a series of 101 short stories starring Herlock Sholmes and Dr. Jotson by Peter Todd, a pseudonym of Charles Hamilton, literally the world record holder for most words ever written. The Adventures of Herlock Sholmes was published in various magazines from 1915 to 1961 and often took the form of humorous parodies of classic Sherlock tales like The Bound of the Haskervilles or The Freckled Hand. Plus, I mean, look at this guy. He's smoking 2 pipes at once. These stories are a goofy take on the Sherlock style, and I support everything they're doing. An anonymous story was published in 6 parts in 1916 titled Herlock Sholmes at It Again. Now, I'm gonna be completely honest here. I can't tell if this is poorly written or just brilliant parody. I have no idea what's going on in this story. Sholmes' sidekick's name changes from Dr. Hotsome to Dr. Plotsome to Dr. Flotsam, and back. Multiple chapters end with, next week, all new characters, only for the following chapter to begin with, characters, same as last week. They keep using words I barely understand, and I don't think I meant to understand. I think everyone dies in an explosion at the end. I love this one so much. From there, we jump ahead a decade and a half to 1931's The South Sea Soup Co. by Kenneth Miller. This story is an over-the-top parody of Sherlock to the point of making absurd leaps of logic and noticing completely innocuous details. Herlock also removes non-existent dust particles from his person far too often. This one made me laugh. It's absurd. It has just the right brand of 1930s comedy. Now, a lot of 1930s comedy obviously didn't age all that well, as I'm sure you all know, but this kind of stuff is just gold to me. Herlock rigged his phone to release a gas that makes you sneeze instead of ringing so that he doesn't have to deal with any pesky noise. I love this man. The South Sea Soup Co. feels like it's satirizing everything and nothing at the same time. Herlock's next appearance came in 1957 in the form of a serialized comic in magazines titled Herlock Sholmes Integral, or Herlock Sholmes Master of Disguise, or Herlock Sholmes Master of the Mask, written by Zvonimir Fertinger and Jules Radilovic. Apologies if I butchered those names, I'm not very familiar with Croatian. This comic was particularly hard to find information on because it's fairly obscure, and I think it was originally only published in Croatia. It got translated into multiple languages in the 2010s, but those are out of print, and I couldn't even find the English one for sale anywhere. The publishing company's website is also just straight up gone, so I think they even went out of business. But anyway, from what I can tell, this comic lasted from 1957 to 1972 and was another comedic parody of Sherlock Holmes stories. There's a chimpanzee in it. I think Herlock fought Tarzan at one point. I honestly don't know. I straight up could not find these comics in English to read, and learning Croatian would take far too long, so my information is severely limited on this one. If anybody has a copy, please send it my way because I would love to check this out someday. This next one almost doesn't count, but it's close enough that I'm including it anyway. The Super Mario Bros. Super Show had an episode titled The Adventures of Sherlock Mario, featuring a character by the name of Herlock Sholmes. Sholmes, not Sholmes, Sholmes. It's a fine distinction, and I'm choosing to count it because I want to. What's interesting about this one is that while they use the name Herlock Sholmes, and it's implied that Herlock Sholmes is the one and only world's greatest detective, and there's no mention of the existence of some kind of counterpart or parody of him, when Mario has to investigate the mystery for himself, he takes the name Sherlock Mario. Not Herlock Mario, not Mario Sholmes. so I have no idea where Mario got the name Sherlock from. But I sure hope somebody got fired for that blunder. The original Herlock Sholmes Arrives Too Late was adapted into a 12-minute short film in 1990 in France. I watched it, but I don't speak French, and I wasn't able to find any proper English dub or sub for it, so I can't really tell how good of an adaptation it is. The visuals look pretty good, and that seems pretty natural, though, seeing as how it was made to be an educational tool for schools rather than just, a movie. Now, 2011 saw the release of Herlock Sholmes The Book by Jeremiah Warren. This is a humorous romp about the world's greatest detective, or maybe just a lucky moron. The book boasts an epic journey of, and I quote, mystery, comedy, romance, action, sci-fi, and monkeys. This time, Herlock's assistant is named Watson. It's a goofy romp that I'm sure I'd have enjoyed if I'd read it when I was a kid. It's a fun little parody of the modern image of Sherlock Holmes, and it just gets weird. The domain name herlocksholmes.com was originally registered for this book, but it has since gone free. I'm beyond tempted to buy it for myself, but I don't really know what I'd do with the site. Maybe I just have it play this video on a loop. Code Realize Guardian of Rebirth is a 2014 otome visual novel where you get to romance various handsome anime boy versions of literary icons and historical figures. Arsene Lupin is like the main guy, so naturally, of course, it features our beloved Herlock Sholmes. They accent it here, so it's not Sholmes, it's Sholmes. Other characters in the game include Victor Frankenstein, Abraham Van Helsing, Impy Barbicane, and the real-life Count of St. Germain. You can romance any of them. There's also Queen Victoria and a little boy version of Dracula. You can't romance them, but they're here. The Super Sentai series of 2018 was Kaito Sentai Lupin Ranger versus Keisatsu Sentai Patch Ranger. It was unique in the way that it had two opposing Sentai teams, one of which being a group of rogue phantom thieves and the other being our boys in blue. Much to my disappointment, it's not one of the Sentai series to get adapted into a Power Rangers season. Lupin Ranger vs. Patch Ranger got a movie known as Kaito Sentai Lupin Ranger vs. Keisatsu Sentai Patch Ranger and film, which features the Lupin Rangers and the Patch Rangers having to team up to take on a greater threat, Herlock Sholmes. He's the world's greatest detective and can also shoot fire from his hands and summon meteors. He's accompanied by his buddy Wilson, who can control vines and create portals. This ain't your grandma's Herlock Sholmes. Perhaps the most obscure use of the name Herlock Sholmes I discovered in my research was a play titled Herlock Sholmes and the Mysterious Case of the Jersey Devil, which, from what I gather, was only performed in October of 2020 by a small community theater in New Jersey. Sholmes and his assistant Dr. Winston arrive in a small town in New Jersey where mysterious murders are being attributed to the Jersey Devil. Honestly, this sounds like a fun time, and I wish I could see it. Maybe I will someday. And with that, we arrive at the reason you're all here. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is finally being localized in 2021. The 2015 and 2017 games featured the regular old Sherlock Holmes in the original Japanese, but the localization wasn't allowed to do that. So instead, we get our beloved Herlock Sholmes here in the West. And I hope you all learned something here about the long and fascinating history of the name Herlock Sholmes. It's an important legacy to live up to, and a lot of people only really cite the Lupin stories. While the Lupin stories are undoubtedly the most famous appearance of Herlock Sholmes, they're not the only, and they're not even the first. Many of the later appearances of the name are in reference to Arsene Lupin, but it seems like just as many had never even heard of it and simply came to the conclusion themselves that they can simply move the S. And now, for the rest of this video, I just want to rattle off some bizarre things that were allowed to use the name Sherlock Holmes, but the stuff that I talked about in this video were not. The short story My Dear Holmes, positively his last appearance on Earth, in which Holmes does not solve any mysteries and dies from sniffing anesthetic. Published in 1928, within Arthur Conan Doyle's lifetime. Shadows over Baker Street, 2003, featuring Sherlock Holmes going toe-to-toe with elements of the Cthulhu mythos. Sherlock Holmes' War of the Worlds, which is basically what if H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds had Sherlock Holmes in it. The Adventure of the Distracted Thane, in which Holmes investigates the murder of King Duncan I of Scotland. You know, from Macbeth El Problema de la Pequeña Cliente, a crossover between Sherlock Holmes and Mary Poppins. The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, a film in which Sherlock Holmes hunts the Loch Ness Monster. Two completely unrelated TV movies released 6 years apart, The Return of Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes Returns, which are both about a cryogenically frozen Sherlock Holmes waking up in the modern day. A 1999 animated series also explores the exact same concept, although that one's in the 22nd century instead of right now. This one has a robot Watson and a clone of Moriarty. And Werewolves on the Moon. Victorian Undead, which featured Holmes fighting zombies. The Adventure of the Peerless Peer, a crossover with Tarzan. The 50th anniversary of DC Comics had an issue where Sherlock Holmes is over 100 years old and teams up with Batman. And a huge amount, really a ridiculous amount of fiction involving Sherlock Holmes fighting a Dracula. As you can see, the rights to Sherlock Holmes are messy, to say the least. But the human desire to circumvent copyright law is universal, and in many cases, different people will come to the exact same conclusion on how to do it effectively, completely independently of one another. Other times, one person will come up with a clever trick that'll be employed by others as time goes on. It's hard to say exactly how many of these Herlock Sholmeses are a direct reference to the Lupin story or some other use of the name, and how many are simply the result of moving the S, but still, I just find it interesting how often the name gets used. And that's not even getting into other ways people have tiptoed around the name. Sesame Street's Sherlock Hemlock, for instance. Dorlock Holmes and Watskins, as portrayed by Daffy Duck and Porky Pig. Dick Tracy's Hemlock Holmes. Yeah, believe it or not, a lot of people want to use and or parody Sherlock Holmes. Who knew?